passage of study comes from the previous chapter, which is John chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. But we're going to do like we've done the other nights. You may have noticed I don't necessarily follow the book word for word. But we're going to talk a little bit about John chapter 14 and verse 6 first. And we will hop over to chapter 13 in just a moment. But I want us to think about all three of these points here. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And let's begin by thinking about the way of Jesus. He is the way in many respects. But let's name a few. What is Jesus the way in? Obviously, he's the way to the Father, but from a tactical perspective, what is he the way in regards to categories and different things that we do?
Truth.
Okay, so he's the way of truth. He goes on to say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Thinking along kind of these lines. What about when it comes to marriage? Right? The world tells us there's all different kinds of ways to marriage. They try to propose now that you can marry an animal. We've even seen situations where folks want to begin marrying robots. And that sounds silly, but this was on CNN. So Jesus is the way when it comes to marriage. Is the Supreme Court the way when it comes to marriage? Are the laws of the land the way when it comes to marriage? No. God's law is the way. Jesus is the way. So in that regards, think of some other categories out there. Jesus is the way. What are some other examples? Y'all are quiet tonight. That's okay. I can keep going. Think about worship. Worship, for example. Folks have all different kinds of ideas as to how to worship. You know, the Muslims, although they say they are not idolatrous, and that's the thing that they are most vehemently against, they go to Mecca and they bow down before what's called the Kaaba. It's that big black box. You may have seen a picture along these lines. And they worship a big black box. Now, that's not the way of Jesus. That's the way of Muhammad. And that's contrary to the Scriptures. You know, they say that they believe in the Old Testament. They say that they don't engage in idolatry. But let's look here at Exodus chapter 20 for just a second and just see some of the contradictions. And if someone could read for me verses 3 through 5 of Exodus chapter 20. 3 through 5 of Exodus chapter 20.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, not serve them, nor serve them, for I am the Lord thy God, and am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate thee.
Good, thank you, brother, very much. So, God makes it very clear. You cannot make something and then bow down to it. That's idolatry. That is forbidden. And so, bowing down to the Kaaba is the way of Muhammad. It's not the way of Jesus. What are some other outlets of worship that are out there other than just Mohammedanism or Muslim or Islam? Buddha, absolutely. Buddha. You might recall the pictures from the trip that Hannah and I took over in Southeast Asia and seeing Hinduism and Buddhism and in Hinduism's case, billions of gods that they have. Bowing down to these gods. If you go out onto the highways nowadays, you'll see folks that are driving around with little images and little figurines on their dashes with all these holy inscriptions and colors and different types of insignia to elevate these little figurines. Those are idols. Those are made with man's hands, and that's been forbidden by God. What are some more conventional ways of worship that, and I say conventional, meaning Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, it's been around for a while. But what are some more conventional outlets of worship?
Well, Catholics, they may worship and pray to the Virgin Mary,
Absolutely, right.
you know,
Sure.
or to the Pope, or.
Sure, and yeah, absolutely. And on the lines of being conventional, you know, they have their traditional ritualistic way, which would include worshiping Mary. I remember we would, during a Mass service, go up to Mary, and you would light candles, offering up prayers to Mary. I mean, that's worship. That's worshiping an idol god. And literally, there was a statue of Mary there. So it's not even Mary, it's a statue of Mary that is being worshipped, which we've studied before. I don't know if you recall, a lot of the reason as to why those types of things came about, including the rosary beads, etc., was because the Catholics attempted to convert Hindus into Catholicism. And so in order to convert them into Catholicism, they said, well, hey, you know, all these prayer beads that you have, all these different idolatrous gods that you have, that's okay. You can keep doing those things, but now you're going to pray the rosary beads instead of your idolatrous prayer beads. And now, instead of praying to all your idol gods, and ancestry worship is very common, you're now going to pray to holy saints, and you're going to pray to Mary, and you're going to pray to the dead apostles. That's kind of the ritualistic, traditional sense of the Catholic Church, but you also have contemporary versions of it as well, where I recall when I used to attend, there would be kind of a teen session, like a teen group, you know, and then there was the traditional kind of way to go about things, and the teen group was, you know, it was like a rock concert essentially, and a lot of times what was occurring was an effort to kind of build up and make us teenagers forget about our troubles for the time being, and make us feel kind of giddy in the moment. And that's more of the conventional sense. But you know, the organ and those kinds of things, they weren't brought into the Catholic Church and many denominations. I mean, you look at the writings, for example, of the different denominational heads, and they opposed vehemently mechanical instruments of music. But it was brought in later. So these are some of the more conventional ways of worship. Let's also think of another conventional form of idolatry. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3. Notice with me here in verse 5. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. You can note verse 16, what we were just referring to. God commands us when we sing, we are to be doing it to teach and to admonish. Well, that doesn't occur if I sit here and bang on an instrument. You're not going to learn anything. That's not teaching. And it's also not going to occur by playing mechanical instruments of music. You'd notice also Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 19, regarding the way in which we are to be singing. It is by plucking our heartstrings. God tells us what to play. He tells us to play our hearts, our minds, not mechanical instruments of music. Go with me to verse 5, though, of Colossians 3, and someone could read that for me here. Here is a conventional form of idolatry. Colossians 3 and verse 5.
Therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry.
Covetousness. So does that mean people are going around and they're worshiping dollars? I mean, not literally, right? They're worshiping it in the sense of the way in which they're living their life. They're coveting after things and desiring things so intently, so earnestly, that it is becoming their God, being covetous. And that is rampant among us, and it's very easy to fall into that trap. You turn on the television and watch just about any show nowadays, and those who are the happiest, those who seem to have the greatest amount of peace and fulfillment and joy in their life are those who have the greatest abundance of material things. And so what Satan is doing is he is influencing us through these various outlets to convince our minds to think, well, that's what I should be pursuing. Of course, watching television isn't wrong, but the point is that we can be influenced by that heavily. And we need to be aware of it, or else we can fall into this trap of modern day or conventional idolatry. So Jesus is the way. We talked about marriage, worship. What are some other ways? Jesus is the way.
before we leave this particular point, Sean, we need to, bring out the idea that even the churches of Christ today are getting to the point of, lots of the larger congregations where they're having these contemporary services
Right.
and then the traditional services.
Right.
Now, I don't see that in God's word at all.
Right.
And I know they got their reasonings, but that is one of the easiest ways to be led off into things that are not right and not scriptural, is to try to appease everybody's personality.
Which you're never going to be able to do anyway.
And then if we look at Jesus talking about He is the way, that is something that just eliminates any other way.
Yeah, exactly, right.
So it doesn't make any difference what religion you pick out, or what idea you pick out, or what type of worship you pick out. When Jesus said, "I am the way," that eliminates everything.
Exactly, right. And to that way of thinking, and we were going to go here eventually anyway, but you're right, it seeps into the Lord's church, which, by the way, how did denominationalism ever come about? I mean, we go to Acts chapter 2, and we read that they were hearing the gospel for the first time as Peter was preaching it. Verse 37, they want to know, what shall we do? Verse 38, Peter tells them. Verses 40 and 41, we read that they were obeying what Peter had told them to do. After they were obeying, verse 41, they that gladly received his word were baptized. If you were to run up to one of those individuals and ask them what denomination they just became a part of, what would they have done? They would have looked at you like you were crazy. In Acts chapter 2, there was no denominationalism. But what folks try to tell us today, and by the way, it's not just in the world of denominational, quote, Christendom, as the scholars call it, in other words, those who claim to follow the scriptures, but it's also even larger. It is a viewpoint that all religions lead where?
To God.
To God,
To
to
God.
heaven.
They all lead to heaven, right? What's the famous saying? Well, we're all going to heaven. We're all just taking different
Rounds.
ways, different routes. But to Hank's point, what did Jesus make it very clear and say? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Brother Larry Fryer will be joining us for our gospel meeting. He will be here Sunday morning, so he's going to kick us off. He used to preach in Monroe when Hannah and I were there. He did a lot of mission work in Sri Lanka. I may have told some of you about this, but he was so dedicated, and I know he won't speak of himself this way, but Hannah and I are very encouraged by their family because sometimes we think life is hard. Listen to this. They were not able to stay in Sri Lanka for longer than 30 days. And so every 30 days, they had to leave the country, stay out of the country for a day, and then come back into the country. They were never able to permanently reside in Sri Lanka, and they did this for years. And Larry Fryer, as he was teaching in that area, of course, again, heavily influenced by idolatry, he was teaching someone the gospel, and he came up to see him one day, and he said, Brother Fryer, come on up here. I want to show you something. And in his place of worship with all of these idols, there stood a statue of Jesus. And he said, I have now decided likewise to worship your Jesus. And Larry said, well, that's not how it works. He is the way. But the idea from this gentleman's perspective was, I'm just going to add Jesus to my buffet of options here, and I'm just going to now say a prayer to him as well, along with all these other gods. And folks want to have it. They want to have it every way. You've seen the bumper sticker signs, coexist. Lots of people are practical universalists. In other words, they're not going to necessarily tell you they believe in universalism, the belief that everyone goes to heaven, but they practice it. In practicality, they do believe it. I've studied with folks before. I may have told you all this at one time, but when you really push them hard, they get very uncomfortable when you start asking them whether or not Hitler is going to be in heaven. I mean, Hitler's easy because universally, even the Germans will admit Hitler was wrong. I'm saying that I'm sure there's defenders out there, but I've not met one. So universally, people generally can agree Hitler is not going to heaven. So when you really press people on this idea that really it doesn't matter how you get there, they get very uncomfortable then when they have to begin thinking about someone such as Hitler and having to answer that type of conundrum that their logic and their belief leads them to. But to Hank's point about, again, conventional worship and contemporary worship and traditional, you know, it's so sad. The church is the melting pot of all demographics, all ages, all races, all previous beliefs, all nations, all ethnicities, because we all get on the same page. And this idea that, well, there's this group over here who doesn't really get along with that group over there, and then there's this group and they do things over here, but they don't really like the way this group over here. Folks, that's clearly rebuked in the scriptures. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 10. That's exactly what they were trying to do as Paul was made known of it, that they were attempting to follow certain people and trying to create divisions within themselves. And Paul is rebuking them in that letter for this divisive attitude and mindset. The church brings all walks of life together, and we all get on, not my page, not Brother Hank's page, not Brother George's page, not Brother Mike's page, not anyone in here's page, on the Lord's page. He is our authority. And so we do what he says. And God, throughout time, has commanded his people to get and stay on the old paths, the traditional paths. Traditional doesn't mean lights or no lights. Traditional doesn't mean PowerPoint or no PowerPoint. Traditional doesn't mean computer or no computer, air conditioning or no air conditioning. That's where folks get confused. Tradition means, what does God command? What has he required of us, and are we doing it? Not all these other areas of judgment that he hasn't given us commands regarding. Those are areas of judgment that we have a way in which that authority is derived via the way in which the church is organized through elders. But notice here in Jeremiah chapter 6, here's a great case study example of people who were uninterested in God's way. If someone could read for me verses 15 through 17. 15 through 17 of Jeremiah chapter 6. Y'all falling asleep already?
Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? Nay, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they should fall among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, stand in the ways, and see and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way, and the walk therein? Ye shall find rest in your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein. Also I set watchmen over you, saying, hearken to the sound of the trumpet. But they said, we will not hearken.
Okay, so God has given them ample opportunity to do what's right. And here they're living in their sin, and they're not ashamed. They're not blushing. And God says, punishment is coming upon you. They've been commanded, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths. God knows that us walking in the old paths doesn't just happen by a knee-jerk reaction and we just snap over to it. We have to seek after it. We have to ask for it. In other words, we have to long for it. In modern culture, especially in today's society, given technology, folks usually aren't very interested in the traditional, antique ways of doing things. They're used to things constantly changing. They're used to having the newest and the greatest before them. They're used to having their software updated every couple months. And they want new. which is fine, physically. There's no problems with being interested in something that works and that is updated. But when it comes to our spirituality, God has commanded us to seek after and to ask for the old paths. God, I want to do things the way your word has commanded me to do things. That's counterculture. That goes against society. That goes against the inclinations of the advancements of the physical and secular world that we are surrounded by. And so we have to seek after it. We have to ask for it. We have to long for it. And God has commanded them to do this in this case, and they said, we will not walk therein. Watchmen have even been set before them, and they have said, we will not hearken. They're not interested. They want to do things their own way. God has always had a way. He has always had a pattern. Hank mentioned just a few moments ago about the Lord's church and some larger congregations, which it's not like large congregation equals an erroneous congregation. I know you weren't saying that at all, but it is true. It does seem to happen sometimes with larger congregations because I think maybe they get so enamored by the numbers they forget, why are we here again? But it was from, unfortunately, teachers within the Lord's church that started teaching this idea that there is no such thing as a pattern that God requires. What's called pattern theology. In other words, for us to say that God requires things to be done in a specific way based upon a specific pattern, well, that's not something that's biblical. And unfortunately, that came from brethren. It actually came, I could get you the article. If you ask me, I'll get it for you if I can find it. But I think I do have it, by Rubel Shelley. The article is actually very interesting. He starts off his thesis in this idea that there's no such thing as pattern theology and that we shouldn't be concerned with the pattern, completely strips away the New Testament commandments regarding how we are to do things. And then guess what he does? He inserts his own pattern and says, this is how we should do things. Everyone has to have a pattern of some kind. The question is whether or not we want to do it according to God's pattern or we want to do it according to our own. Let's look at a few verses here. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8, and can someone read for me there verse 5? Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5.
Who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain.
Thank you, brother, very much. And you all remember when we studied the Pentateuch, and we've looked at these verses regarding the requirements for the tabernacle. Remember the specifics that God gave for the tabernacle. All the details required concerning the garments, concerning the way in which things were to be laid out, concerning the very material that was to be used. God was very, very, very specific. And what do we read over and over and over again in those accounts? The children of Israel did all according to the way in which the Lord commanded them. So there was a specific pattern that God had laid out as to how things were to be done. And sometimes folks say, and to Hank's point as to this seeping into the Lord's church, but again, we got to remember, where did denominationalism come from? It came out of where? Acts chapter 2, there's one church. Whose is it? It's the Lord's. It's Christ's church. But we have all these denominations now. Where did they come from? Well, you had congregations that went into error. And we've studied that before, the start of the Catholic Church. A departure from God's pattern concerning organization. Hey, we want an elder over many congregations, not just one. I get to be the chief elder over this many congregations, and then another chief elder. And then all of a sudden you have bishops. And all of a sudden you have Mr. Papa in 606 AD. But, this idea of God being narrow-minded, or it being narrow-minded, that there's only one way or there's only one pattern. Think about the history of the Scripture. Has there ever been other cases where there's only been one way? Let's go to Genesis chapter 6. Was God specific in regards to a pattern concerning Noah. And here's a question. Was Noah narrow-minded because he did it according to the way that God had commanded him? Well, let's answer that question. If someone could read for me verses 14 through 17 of Genesis 6.
Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. The breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die.
Okay, thank you, brother, very much. So notice the commandments. We're going to look at the specifics in just a second, but notice verse 22. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. So Noah did exactly what God told him to do. Now, notice the options Noah had before him. Verse 15, the length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. What if Noah had said, you know what, that's a lot of ark. By the way, in Lexington, they have the ark, what is it called? Do y'all remember? It's by the Creation Museum, I think. I think they're kind of connected. But I think it's just the ark. I think it's just called the ark, isn't it? I have not been, but we have family members who have been. But it is to these specifications. I mean, it was built based upon the way God commanded Noah. And if you look at that, I mean, it is huge. So just imagine Noah sitting here thinking, God, 300 cubits? I mean, that's a lot of work. I don't think we need an ark that big. I think we're going to just make it 150 cubits. That's not what he did, verse 22. And then we see the other dimensions, the breadth of it 50 cubits, the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark. Well, I don't really need a window. That's not essential. It's not a big deal. He couldn't have said that, right? And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. Well, we don't need a door. I mean, we're not getting out until after the whole earth is flooded. I mean, we just climb out somehow. We don't need a door. And notice likewise what kind of wood was to be used. Verse 14. Gopher wood. So he couldn't have just said, well, you know what, I have a better idea as to what kind of wood. I have a different thought in mind. Folks, the point is here, as we think about these different questions, Jesus has a way concerning marriage. Jesus has a way concerning worship. Jesus has a way concerning the church and how it's patterned, which is where we are now. Man does not like to submit. That's what it boils down to. Submission is not fun. What is the difference between obedience and submission? We went a little bit through this yesterday, thinking about the command that God has given us regarding loving Him with all of our being, Mark 12 and verse 30. Can you obey without submitting? Yes, because you just go through the motions. You don't really care about it. You've ever told your children, like we do, I mean, every time we're here, all right, it's time to go. And either they walk in that direction, or if they actually follow us, they're dragging their feet extremely slowly. Are they submitting or are they obeying? They're obeying. They're not submitting themselves. If they were submitting themselves, they'd dart out the door. Submission is hard. Submission is very, very hard. And man sometimes struggles with submission so much that he thinks, because I don't want to do it this way, I don't have to. And then usually what will follow is, God speaks to my heart. God speaks to my heart. What essentially people are saying when they say that is, I don't want to do it God's way. I want to do it my own way, and I just feel better about that. Let me ask you a question. Do you think Jesus wanted to go to the cross? We know he didn't want to go to the cross, right? He prayed, asked not to go. But did he go? In going, did that make him feel good? Could he have very easily said, I'm not going to go? God spoke to my heart. He would have felt a lot better not going. He wouldn't have died. But he knew that his Father's will required him to go. And so submission is doing that which we don't want to do because God has commanded us to do it, and finding the attitude to want to do it. That's what submission is. In our society today, we just don't understand that. An illustration was painted to me in preaching school, and I'll never forget it. A man died and had a will for his 3 boys. And the will had 3 requirements. The father wanted the boys to build a well near the lake, a dock on the lake, and a cabin in the woods. And the boys took a look at the will and they said, you know what? We agree with Dad here. A dock on the lake makes a lot of sense. We've always wanted a dock on the lake. Grateful that Dad left us this money, and his will is that we build a dock on the lake. That makes a lot of sense. We're going to go build that dock on the lake. So they go build the dock. And then they look at the will again and they say, build a cabin in the woods. You know what? That makes a lot of sense, having a cabin in the woods. That's real handy. We're going to put a cabin out there in the woods. So thankful Dad's left us the money to do this, and his will is to put a cabin in the woods. We're going to go put a cabin in the woods. We agree with this. This makes a lot of sense. So they go build a cabin in the woods. Then they get to the well and they say, a well by the lake. You know what? That doesn't make a lot of sense. There's already water over there. If you're going to have a well, don't you want the well up by the cabin? I don't agree. We don't agree. We shouldn't put a well by the lake. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We're going to build the well up by the cabin. We're not going to build it by the lake. How many times did his sons submit? 0. Didn't submit any. They agreed with the first 2. So submission wasn't required. It's not that they didn't obey. They obeyed. But the one where they had the opportunity to submit was the building of the well, but they didn't agree with it, so they didn't submit, and they ended up disobeying. And that's how folks are today. They don't like God's pattern. They don't want to submit to God's pattern. They like their ideas better. They have this thought that God speaks to their heart, which again is extremely common. I remember Hannah's grandfather telling us that when we were studying with him, and it's a common belief. But we studied, I believe it was Sunday night, from 2 Timothy chapter 3, 16 and 17. What completes us? What teaches us? What instructs us? What is it? It's God's word. It's not our own heart. Our own heart can fool us. Our own heart can cause us to go astray. Stay with me here in Genesis chapter 6, but I want us to also flip over to Proverbs for just a moment. Let's go to the book of Proverbs. And if someone could get for me verse 12 of chapter 14. Verse 12 of chapter 14 in the book of Proverbs.
There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death.
Okay? There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Let's go to chapter 16 as well. Chapter 16. And if someone could read for me there, verse 25.
There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death.
Okay, it sounds very similar, doesn't it? God doesn't use bold or underline or italics. God uses emphasis by repeating things. Every word is important in the law of God, in the Bible, but there are some times when things have been repeated. And here's one of those times. God is making it clear to us that it is dangerous for us to trust in our own heart. The end of that is death. Let's go to chapter 28 now, and look with me in verse 26. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 26.
He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walketh wisely, he shall be delivered.
Okay, here is a passage that talks about trusting in our heart. Why is our heart being biblical mind, we say my heart, but what we're saying when we say that is, it's what I understand, it's what I know. Why is it so easy for us to trust in our heart? Think about a math problem that you've had to do before that you've not been taught how to do yet. And maybe you're of the creative type or the initiative type where you're willing to just get your hands dirty and try to just start figuring it out. Have you ever done that before and you figure it out and wow, this is making a lot of sense. I think I'm going to have the right answer. And you do all these things and you get to the answer. And then the teacher comes and says, no, it's not even close. You're way off. Now you thought in your mind when you're doing the problem that I know exactly what I'm doing here. This makes a lot of sense to me. But what were you lacking? A whole lot of information, a whole lot of correction, a whole lot of experience that would have guided you and told you, no, that's wrong. You're missing it here. Because if you go down this path, this is what's going to happen. It's easy for us to trust in our heart. Why? Because we're comfortable with it. I know this. It's uncomfortable for me to change. It's uncomfortable for me to recognize that I need to do things a different way based on the way in which the Lord has commanded me. So it's very foolish for us to think that we can trust in our heart. Let's just look at a few more verses. Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23. Someone could read that for me. Yes, please.
O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps.
Okay, so another option and way that we can do things, if we choose to pattern things, our approach toward the Lord in our own viewpoint, God is telling us it's not in us to direct our steps. Let's go to Proverbs 3 now. Proverbs 3 and verse 5.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding.
Okay, so God telling us to trust in Him with all of our heart and lean not unto our own understanding. It's very easy to think that we have it figured out and we can do things our own way. So let's go back over to Genesis chapter 6 again. Genesis chapter 6, and notice verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. What is this kind of state? Man is absent from the commandments and instructions of God. Man is not interested in what God has to say. We learn in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Noah did what God commanded him to do. We reviewed this last night. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. What are these people doing? Are they listening to God's word? No. They're opposed. They're absent of God's instructions. And so now, let's think about Noah. What if Noah had conformed to their way of thinking? God, by His graciousness, verse 8, then commands Noah how to be saved and build an ark, 14 through 17. And Noah could have said, you know what, God, I hear what your commandments say, but I'm not going to do what you require. Noah wouldn't have been saved. And Noah wouldn't have been able to free himself from the punishment that ultimately was coming to all those others mentioned in verse 5. And so there's lots of different ways that are out there. But folks, the reality is one of the most dangerous ways that we have before us is our own. It's our own way. It's our own thoughts and our own ideas. Any comments here on the way?
Well, I think in the world, we look at things in a different light than we should in the spiritual world.
Right.
And mankind today figured out, well, if there's a better way I can do this, I'll find it out and do it the best way it can be done.
Right.
They don't come to the realization that what God's way and what the spiritual world is,
Right.
that what His way is the perfect end,
That's right.
which is eternity, and His way is the only way that you're gonna get to that situation
Right.
of eternity. So, but we look at it in the physical sense of,
Exactly.
you know, if I can build a better mousetrap, let me build it.
Right.
And, it's just it's amazing how we try to put the spiritual world and the physical world together
Right.
to try to come up with a plan, and you can't do that.
Correct.
There's no way.
Correct.
I mean, you gotta view them as distinctively in themselves and not try to mix them up.
Correct. Correct. And it's a little bit like Captain Capsize over here, getting a compass that was broken because it was from an unreliable compass maker. Mankind is not going to have those answers for spirituality. And we try to apply the way in which we approach physical things to then spiritual things. And that's a lot of the reason why you have denominations and creed books and doctrinal books, because man says, well, I've been able to organize something. I've been able to participate and lead something. And now it's time for me to somewhat set it in stone and make sure things stay in order. And in a corporation, in a company, in a family business or whatever, that makes a lot of sense and that's needful. And it can bring a great deal of benefits to people. But in the spiritual world, the Lord's already done that for us, and it's right here. If we have anything less than the Bible, we don't have enough. If we have anything more than the Bible, we have too much. And if we have the same thing as the Bible, we don't need it because we already have the Bible. And so God has already given us the way. And you know, it's interesting because you're saying that folks are willing to innovate and willing to try new things, and folks are, but there's also folks who are also very, very stubborn and particular about physical things sometimes. And it's interesting how folks will be so particular about a physical thing and expect everyone else to agree with them and think the same way they do, but yet they don't think they need to be particular about God's Word, right? I'm sure we've all got scenarios and situations like that, right?
If you don't do things my way, it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just areas of insignificance, right? I mean, Hannah's grandmother, Hannah and I used to go over there and just spend time with them and help them a little bit. And we try to like clean up their house because they were getting older. And her grandmother's still alive, very old, but still healthy, but still alive. But she is very particular. And she would have us use baby oil to dust. And she was very, 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 very particular. And wanted to make sure that you couldn't just dust, you had to put baby oil on the dust rag. And every time you took out the trash, it doesn't matter if you were wearing gloves, you had to wash your hands. Every time. Hannah and I joke now because we're trained. Every time we even touch anything close to the trash, we have to go wash our hands. And those are just two things, but I think we all can think of examples of folks that we know who are very particular. I mean, only Apple phones, right? All other phones are awful. You can only, and I mean, they will get in arguments with people about how that's the only way. But that's a physical thing. That doesn't even matter. That's the stuff that doesn't matter, that God doesn't care about, that we can do whatever we want with. The things that He requires of us are written right here that we're to follow, and they pertain unto godliness and unto our eternal salvation. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. And that's what we care about. That's what we care about. So Jesus is the way. Any other comments there? Whether it be marriage, whether it be worship, whether it be organization of the church. Any other comments or thoughts on that?
Not necessarily about the way, but I was sitting here thinking, reading about Noah. And, he built the ark by faith, but it would have been so easy for Noah to say, wait a minute, it's never rained on earth.
It's right. It hadn't even rained yet.
It hadn't rained.
Correct.
They didn't know what rain was.
Correct.
They didn't, they had no idea what a flood was.
Correct.
So it would have been very easy for him to say, what in the world do we need with this?
Correct.
And,
Absolutely.
but yet he went ahead and done it according to what God said.
Exactly. Right. And again, talk about narrow-mindedness, how many people were saved in that flood? 8. Some estimates say that there were millions. I think some estimates even say billions of people already at this point. Because remember, they lived so long here. 8. 8. So folks, narrow-mindedness, let's not be concerned about whether we're narrow-minded or open-minded. Let's just be God-minded. And if we're God-minded, I don't care if you say I'm narrow-minded. My goal is not to make sure that you don't think I'm narrow-minded. I'm not trying to please you. I'm trying to please God.
Well, we basically better be narrow-minded because narrow
Right.
is the way.
Correct. And being God-minded is in a lot of ways being narrow-minded because, unfortunately, there's a lot of folks who are just not interested. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14 speaks to that very reality. And Noah and the account there is evidence of it. Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. You know, the Catholics say, well, we're the largest religion in the world. Well, based on this verse, you might want to double check yourself there. Verse 14, because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Few there be that find it. Why? Well, because a lot of folks don't want to give up their own way. They don't want to give up their own way. Just to refer to 8 souls, let's go to 1 Peter chapter 3 for just a second. 1 Peter chapter 3, and if someone could read for me here verses 20 and 21. 20 and 21 of 1 Peter chapter 3.
Who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
All right, thank you, brother, very much. So again, 8 souls were saved. So Jesus is the way. Jesus is also the truth. Jesus is also the truth. How many truths are there?
1.
There's 1, right? What does our society tell us?
Whatever you want, whatever you feel.
Truth is whatever you decide it's going to be today,
Decide you're wrong.
which makes no sense, because how is it true then?
Well, I think we need to look at truth as maybe a different word would be absolutely.
Absolute truth.
You know, because,
Right.
you know, truth can, you know, you sort of,
There's contextual situations,
you know, that-
sure.
especially in the physical world,
Right.
truth might mean different things.
Right,
But, and you know, you might say, well, like, if I do this equation,
correct,
if I come out, well, this is true.
correct.
I had a math teacher years ago that, when we didn't have calculators and all that kind of stuff, and we had sticks we had to add up and stuff like that, but, if you got, and I remember it well in algebra 2, and that's when you get, bombarded with all the equations.
Right,
Well, as long as you got the equation in its proper form, even if you didn't get the right physical answer, she would give you credit for it.
sure.
Because you done it right, but yet you still come out with the wrong answer, so. I think sometimes we misuse the word truth, and we separate it here again, we gotta separate it from the physical and the spiritual
Sure.
world when we start talking about it.
Sure, well, even spiritually, there are, and this is a difficult topic to get into, because if you're not careful, people take it the wrong way and they apply it in the wrong ways. But let's go to Proverbs 26 for just a moment. Proverbs 26, and if someone could read for me verses 4 and 5.
Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit.
So there's certain circumstances and situations where, based upon, of course, Proverbs being a book of wisdom, we have to apply the scriptures based upon the inputs we are receiving. We have to determine what the best solution is in that point in time. However, the problem is people try to then use that in situations that are very clearly defined, and it doesn't matter what the inputs are. A primary example of that, for example, is worship, and the way in which God has commanded worship to be. Let's just go over roles, because this is the one that the world kind of flocks to. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2, and if someone could read for me there, verses 9 through 14. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 14.
In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression.
Thank you, brother, very much. If someone could look at, or let's just look at verse 8 as well. I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that women. And so God here is giving us specific commandments concerning roles within the church, concerning leadership, concerning authority. Notice verse 15, but if I tarry, and this is chapter 3 and verse 15. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And so God is giving commandments as to how the church is to be conducted, how it is to behave and function. And here, specific commandments are being given regarding gender and regarding leadership roles. Likewise, look at chapter 3. Notice here in verse 2, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife. Drop down as well to verse 8. Likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre. Then drop down to verse 11. Even so must their wives be grave. Verse 12. Let the deacons be the husband of one wife. And so God has made it clear regarding leadership roles within the church that gender plays a part in that. So you have the verses that we looked at just a few moments ago in the book of Proverbs. I believe it was verses 5 and 6, if I remember correctly. 26, Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, where situationally, based upon the inputs we're given, we have to determine how to answer somebody. But here, God has given us commandments. Now, here's what folks will try to do. Scholars, biblical scholars, it's funny, you go to school to learn the Bible in an academic setting and get a graduate degree, and a lot of times what these scholars teach you is to reject the Bible entirely. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what they try to say is, hey, this is all cultural. It doesn't matter if elders are men, they can be women. It doesn't matter if deacons are men, they can be women. It doesn't matter if those teaching are men, they can be women. Teaching in a mixed assembly such as this, again, usurping authority over a man. It doesn't matter if men are praying, that can be women. That was the culture back then. And so Paul had to write those things. No, we can't do that to God's Word. God has clearly defined how these roles are set out and given very plain qualifications as to how things are to be conducted in His church. Likewise, it's very interesting that God also, in explaining why things are organized the way that they are, uses something that completely transcends all cultures for all generations. How does He do that? Look here. Verse 11, let the women learn in silence with all subjection. Verse 12, this is chapter 2 of 1 Timothy. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Verse 13, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. What's God's justification for this? Creation. You can't go back any further, and you can't in any way say culturally it should change, because God is using literally the entire existence of time up until the very point at which Paul is writing this as proof as to why things are to be done this way. Likewise, look at verse 14. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. So God is giving us this information. We don't deserve it. He doesn't have to give us this. But it's interesting, the argument that folks will use, because it just doesn't apply. So you're right, brother. There is absolute truth. And when it comes to the way in which God has commanded us to do things, that is truth, absolutely. Now, folks will try to tell us, well, there's no such thing as absolute truth. And that statement in and of itself is error. Because I've just made a statement that is making an absolute. There's no such thing as absolute truth. Well, am I absolutely sure about that? Yes. So you're saying it is absolutely true that there's no such thing as absolute truth? Yes. That contradicts itself. What people are really trying to say is, I don't want to change my life. And I want truth to be what I want it to be, and I want you to leave me alone. That's what folks are saying. Yes, Brother Hank, about absolute truth. What about, and I know we're running out of time here, I think we have a few minutes. 8:21, right? Who's ringing the bell? Is it 8:21, is that right? 8:10? So we have 3 minutes? That's not enough time to go through John 13. Well, on life, think about this for just a moment, and then we'll look at John 13 briefly. Think about, go to Acts 17 with me. Think about why we would follow Jesus and not Muhammad, and not Confucius, and not Buddha. Why Jesus? Verse 31 in Acts chapter 17, because he's talking about God, verse 30, hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained. What's God saying? He's appointed a day that he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man, that man whom he hath ordained. Which man is this? Whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he raised him from the dead. In other words, if you have any questions as to whether or not you should be doing what Jesus says, and only what Jesus says, he's been raised from the dead. And this is in the context of Paul addressing the men of Athens. Note there, starting at verse 22. So they're idolatrous. They got idols everywhere. He recognizes their idolatry and addresses them, referring to the unknown God that they were worshiping in verse 23. And then he's pointing them ultimately to worship and follow God, the one true and only living God. And how can we have assurance that we should do what he says? Because he's been raised from the dead. He's living eternally with the Father. So Jesus is the way, he is the truth, he is the life. Let's look at John 13 just briefly. I'm not going to read the passage because we don't have time, but you can read it, and I encourage you to do that. And when you read it, verses 1 through 17, think of it this way. One of the members there that Jesus is going to wash the feet of is Judas Iscariot. And what will Judas go and do right after this? He will go betray Jesus. But what is Jesus about to do to him? He's about to wash his feet. The next time you are really struggling to sacrifice yourself, to give yourself, to do good unto others, to do something that you're uncomfortable doing and don't want to do, but you know that this is an opportunity to serve, and to submit yourself unto the Lord, and to submit yourself for service to benefit this person. Think about Jesus, God in the flesh, washing the feet of the man who is about to go betray him and cause him to be put to death. That's what Jesus did. And Jesus in no way should have to wash any man's feet, just as Peter states. But what Jesus was doing, as he explains in verse 15, is giving us an example.
And what's so great about that, Sean, is Jesus knew that he was gonna be betrayed by that man.
Right.
So, if we do good to people,
I know.
not knowing that 10 minutes from then, they could turn around and do harm to us.
Right, right.
But Jesus knew it, so it would be a lot harder for us to do good
Right.
if we knew somebody was gonna do harm to us later on.
Correct. It's very easy to do good to someone who you know is going to turn right back around and do good to you,
Yeah.
right? It's very hard to do good to someone that you're not sure if they're going to do good to you. Can you imagine doing good to someone that you know is about to cause you being put to death? And that's what Jesus did. And so, hey, it's hard. We all have folks that we're around in our life that we, maybe even saying hi to them with a smile is painful for us. But think here of Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life, and the example that he set for us, and the freedom that we have in following that example by submitting ourselves and being a living sacrifice for him. Thank you all very much for the class. Enjoyed it, and looking forward, Lord willing, to tomorrow night.